less photographs, but those who understand something about photographs and the quality of them told me that the quality was better than last year. And the highly respected jury had made their choice, and the winner, with a picture that is depicting not a humanoid but a border guard in a special situation, is Krzysztof Marciniak, Polish border guard. I will just say that don't try to find too much message on the fact that the prize is a camera. It's a special camera. This is not just a implicit hint to improve the. Okay. But here you are. Thank you. It's something special. Thank Congratulations you. Once again.
Well, it's time to kick off our third debate of today in accordance with the program, border security through the eyes of the citizens. For this afternoon's session, I will be your moderator. My name is Edgar Beugels. I'm the head of the Research and Development Unit in Frontex. And this topic, the borders and security through the eyes of the citizens, this is quite often, in my opinion, a forgotten thing, a forgotten topic. Citizens might have different feelings about the border. As you can imagine, people are living in an area where the pressure of illegal migration is quite high. He or she might be facing problems right at his or her doorstep. And that person might have a completely different feeling about borders and border security than a person who has to cross the border each and every day to get to work, to get to school, or whatever. That person might see the border as a hurdle. Another person may have other priorities. He or she may fear a terrorist or a possible terroristic attack, which also means that this fear will shape the vision of that person of the border. But then again, when talking about security, border security, but security in a broader context, what does security mean? What does security mean for the citizen? I can imagine that somebody who's at this moment living in, let's say, Spain, to give an example, might have something completely different on his mind while talking about security than somebody who's living at the border between Greece and Turkey. In Spain, you might be afraid of losing your job. Job security we're talking about there. If you are living at the border Turkey-Greece, you might be facing completely different problems related to the border, to the security. But it's only to show that, I mean, all too often, especially when we're talking in this kind of community with people who work at the borders, who have jobs that are related to the borders, we make or shape a kind of idea that we have about borders and border security. But we should always keep in mind that security concepts especially might mean different things for different people at different moments in time even. And with this kind of opening remarks, I very much would like to give the floor today this afternoon at Dr. Jake Clark, professor at the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies. He's the director of the program on civil security. And I would like to ask him to, I mean, you are also a private citizen, and you also come in contact with borders, with border security. How do you see that? What's your feelings about border security?
Thanks very much for the opportunity to come here this afternoon and address this audience. As a private citizen, the perception that I think I share with many of my other private citizens is the unfortunate perception that border security is confined to the border. That's where the border guards operate, and that's the only time you see them. And I think that's unfortunate because it's evident to me in the work that I've been doing in civil security that border security does not begin and end at the border. It has to be extended forward into the partner and neighboring nations, so it involves the ability to conduct negotiations on an international scale. And then, of course, it's extended in depth as well. And so border security professionals must work in close cooperation with other security and law enforcement professionals. And so I say that it's this impression that border security only takes place at the border is misleading. And I think is something that needs to be emphasized in the public image of the Border Security Force, is that it's not just at the border. The second thing is that I think the impression is that border security is concerned only with occasional smuggling and other crimes that are perceived by the public to be petty in nature. And yet I think the reality is you deal with major crimes, major criminal organizations who recognize that borders are not a hindrance or a nuisance. Borders represent a business opportunity from a criminal perspective, and certainly from a terrorist perspective, it represents an opportunity for protection. You can hide behind borders. These aspects are not well understood by the public, and yet I think it's absolutely critical and essential to the kind of work you do. The third thing is that border security is a part of the civil security paradigm. We teach this at the Marshall Center, and it's very important, but it is closely linked with other aspects of security, such as transportation security, such as critical infrastructure protection, and ultimately crisis management and consequence management. And the ability of border security professionals to contribute to the civil security paradigm and work, again, in close cooperation, not only with other law enforcement personnel, but with other security forces, including the military, is also something that the public does not perceive well, and yet represents, I think, an important part of what you're doing. So those are the perceptions I have, and if I can just extend it just a little bit into the area of transportation security, which I think is going to be covered in some detail this afternoon. You know, the public does complain about some of the security measures that are taken at airports and elsewhere, but my own view is that they're minor in nature. The difficulty resides in the threat perception. And there is a big difference, particularly as an American in the transatlantic area. There's a big difference between what Americans perceive to be the threats in this realm and the perceptions here. And as a consequence, the Americans have security procedures in place which are viewed very negatively by the population in Europe. I found that out today. I had conversations with representatives of the Polish Foreign Ministry, and the issue, of course, was visas and the ability to go to the United States. And this is costing the United States a great deal. People that I know won't travel to the United States anymore because they perceive it to be too much of a burden in terms of paperwork and visas and so forth. And so this is difficult. And the problem is this balance between security and liberty and how that's dynamic and moves. It's not a constant. And once you put security measures in place, they're very difficult to remove. And there's a real reluctance on the part of political leaders and other security professionals to remove them, because if an incident does happen, then you pay the price for having removed the security procedures, which may or may not be linked to the incident, but will be perceived by the public in that way. So it's but the image is an important one that I think, and the bottom line is that border guards do a lot more than just border security, and that story has not been told to the public, and they don't appreciate it.
But it just makes me wonder, if it's not understood by the public, should it still be done? Because apparently it has no influence.
the point is that border security is more than just security of the border area. All of these other things that I mentioned are key and essential. They have to be done. And what we've been trying at the Marshall Center to move towards is a new paradigm of a civil security professional, which includes all of those areas that I just mentioned: transportation security, critical infrastructure, and so forth. That would enable a border security professional to move into different areas of security, bringing with him or her his knowledge or her knowledge in the area of border security and applying it to some of these other areas. For example, there are aspects of critical infrastructure protection which rely on some basic border security principles. Having borders that are open, secure, and closed at the same time. And that's true for a lot of critical infrastructure. It has to be able to function in a secure environment, and yet it is protected from criminals and terrorists. So at the Marshall Center in particular, we're trying to move in that direction of creating, at least in theory, an idea of a civil security professional who is able to function in a lot of these areas.
Just makes me wonder about one thing. On the one hand, you said before, some of the things are not understood by the public. And then it raises the question, you said some things have to be done. Who determines at the end of the day what has to be done? And how does it relate to the balance, as you call it, between security and liberty? Maybe we have gone too far with the security, and maybe we should push back.
It's a fascinating area. When there is an incident, the public demands and politicians, political leaders provide additional security. So the pendulum swings very much in the direction of more security. And then over time, as there are no incidents or just minor incidents, the public grows restless with security procedures. But as I say, there's always a reluctance on the part of political leaders and others to remove them for fear of having to pay the consequences if something happens. And so it's a very difficult balance to strike at any given time, because it's always changing in response to the changes in the security environment, responses to changes in the threats and the perceptions of the threats. The difficulty is that the public perception of what constitutes threats differs radically in many countries from what we call elite opinion. Political leaders and other very senior security professionals have a perception of the threat that is quite different in many countries, certainly in my own and elsewhere, of what constitutes the most important threats to our security and our safety. Efforts to educate the public about those threats are not generally successful. And the reason is that the public grows restless. They think that many security procedures are unnecessary, and then when nothing happens, they lose interest in them. And it's always difficult for a political leader, particularly when it involves the expenditure of resources, to justify paying additional money for a security procedure or a security paradigm that cannot be directly related to protection. There has to be a causal relationship between the security measures that are taken and the fact that an incident did not occur. And it's always difficult to prove a negative. Something didn't happen, and you have to establish that it's because of all the security measures we're taking. And that relationship is very difficult to establish, and for a politician who has to spend resources, very difficult to justify.
It makes me wonder, because if you look to some time ago there was somebody who said the amount of people that are killed every year by terrorists or at the hands of terrorism is lower than the amount of people that are being killed each year in the US alone in their bathrooms. So why does it justify to invest millions in security and not maybe a campaign to make the public more aware of the dangers of their bathrooms?
I think the answer to that question lies in the fear on the part of the elite leaders. The elite, by elite I mean senior I don't mean elite in the way that you might understand it, but very senior media and other professionals, that the threat is not terrorism per se, the threat is catastrophic terrorism. That is to say, terrorists will be able to smuggle into the United States through the transportation system, through our porous borders that we have with both Mexico and Canada, a weapon of mass disruption, or even a weapon of mass destruction. And that would be a game changer. And that's why even today, 10 years after September 11th, the threat of terrorism, catastrophic terrorism, remains the #1 security priority of the United States government, and very few people in this room share that threat perception. I know you don't. I think, based on my experience at the Marshall Center, you're far more concerned with crime and corruption and other issues. And this threat of terrorism is not top on your list. And the reason this is so important is because we have an alliance, a transatlantic alliance, and that has to be predicated on a common threat perception. Any alliance is always predicated on a common perception of the threat. And we don't have that. We don't have that in the North Atlantic Alliance. And I think, it's another subject for another discussion, but it relates very much to the issues of security because we don't see things in the same way.
Thank you, John. Jack, sorry. In a lot of cases, the increase of security goes hand in hand with the person who wants to cross the border giving up personal information, personal data. And I can imagine that for some people, the limits are reached or close to be reached. And also that questions may arise as to what do you need it for? In other words, how far can this, call it intrusion, in my personal life go? Katarzyna Kwadrat-Grzybowska, Policy and Consultancy at the European Data Protection Supervisor. What do you think? Are we at the limits or?
Thank you. Yes, it's on. Thank you. First of all, I wanted to thank for the invitation. As mentioned, I'm a legal advisor to the European Data Protection Supervisor. And I think I should start with a few words about our institution, what the EDPS does and how it relates to your work. And then, of course, I will make a number of remarks on how data protection and border management can be brought together and what we believe should be taken into consideration in a border security policy that should be at the same time efficient, understandable, acceptable by the citizens, and also data protection compliance. The European Data Protection Supervisor is an independent supervisory body in the European Union. It's one of the institutions in the European Union. And in our role, we supervise EU institutions, bodies, and agencies when it comes to the processing of personal data. We also advise the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council on all proposals which have or might have impact on data protection. We also very closely cooperate with data protection authorities at national level. And together we supervise large-scale systems such as Eurodac, Customs Information System, and in the near future, Visa Information System. We also issued a number of opinions which are then translated into all languages of the European Union, and they can be found in the official journal on such issues as integrated border management, internal security strategy, information management strategy, or the revision of the Frontex regulation. So this is just a little bit to say why we are here to address this issue. The first question is what do citizens see at the borders? And you might say sometimes they see nothing or not much because within the Schengen area, in principle, border checks no longer exist. Sometimes they see more than before, and this is of course in the context of intrusive checks at the airports. Sometimes you don't see much, but you know that things exist, and this is in the context of PNR analysis, for example, when you are flying to US or Canada. So I think that this perception of what the citizens see at the border is very important, and it's very much related to data protection principles and to privacy principles. What I need to say in the beginning is that, in fact, of course, EDPS does not deny that information technology is an important tool in border management. And I like the statement made in the previous panel where someone said that technology is fundamental to address the modern security risks. And we very much agree with this statement. At the same time, we need to remember that technology, border technology, involves the processing of vast amount of personal data. And that is not only a concern to data protection authorities at national level or to the European Data Protection Supervisor, but this is a concern to citizens. So my first message would be transparency, that we should explain data protection, that we should inform the citizens about what data actually is exchanged, to whom that data is transmitted, for which purposes. And as I said already, it's very much related to basic data protection principles like the proportionality, necessity principle, the purpose limitation principle, which are actually, you can find them in the Directive 95/46 and in the regulation, the legal obligations. And I think that much can be done by informing the citizens about their rights. The right to access data, the right to information about the data, about the right to rectification, and so on. Another thing, another issue which I wanted to mention is trust. Trust is very important. At the EDPS, we have a very practical approach to data protection, if I may say so, which means that data protection should not be seen as an obstacle to efficient exchange of information or efficient border management. Data protection, and this is how data protection and border management can be brought together. Data protection should be actually seen as a precondition for success in this area, because it can increase the mutual trust. Of course, you trust your partner when you transmit personal data, that this data will be treated in accordance with the data protection rules, that it will be transmitted only with your consent. You also trust that when you receive data, the data is accurate, which is also a very important element for you when you have a big database, to have quality data, to have data which is accurate. But it's a mutual trust between you and your partner, but it's also about a mutual trust between you and the citizens. If the citizens do not understand or they do not have information, of course they will be less cooperative or they will be more suspicious. So I think this is an important message, the trust. Something which was mentioned already in the previous panel is the concept which is called privacy by design. I would like to come back to this concept because it's also something which is advocated by the EDPS and by the data protection authorities. So when you start thinking about a new system, you should take data protection principles into account. When you start creating, or when you start thinking of a design, then you should also take data protection from the very beginning into consideration, and that will be data protection compliant, but at the same time it will be more efficient for the tool that you are creating. So in principle, I believe there is no gap between data protection and border management. If border management tools are really data protection or data protection friendly. This is one of the messages. How to achieve it? We call and we speak a lot about the need for evaluation. What we have already in place, as you know very well, is a very complex patchwork of systems. There are some large-scale systems which are already established, but not fully or not at all assessed, like Schengen Information System like Eurodac. There are systems which are legally established but not yet in operation, like the visa information system. There are also systems which are in the pipeline, and we heard today a lot about the entry-exit system, registered travelers program, or EU ESTA. So there is a need for evidence, there is a need for the demonstration of the evidence that those systems are really needed. And so we welcomed, for example, an exercise which is launched now in the Council in the context of the European Information Exchange model, that is to evaluate all existing instruments in the field of information exchange and to see whether new systems are really needed, first of all. And this is once again the proportionality and necessity principle. So before you actually, something which is technically possible does not mean that it is necessary. And this is quite essential from the perspective of data protection. Need for evidence. So I think that this is more or less what I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, exactly this last point was the thing that came to my mind when you were talking about, yes, information has to be given to the citizen as to what for the data is collected. There should be a basis of mutual trust so that the information is not used for other purposes or abused. Privacy by design, you said, but yeah, I still had the question in my mind. It's, yes, but what is it needed for and how far should we go? I mean, it can still have a justification that there is a need to collect that information from the point of view of security, border security. But is it acceptable? Is it acceptable to the citizen? Where, at what point, although there might be an identified need on the part of the ones that would like to work with this information, but I could still imagine that there is a situation that, from the point of view of the citizen, you can say, no, this goes too far. And how is that? How do you see that that is taken into account? Because, like I said, information was given. There is trust as such. There is an apparent need on the part of the security world, let's say the border security world, but still, this might go too far.
Yes, I didn't say that when you give information, then there is no issue anymore, of course. But giving information is already a first step, and then. And I also spoke about the need for evidence. This need for evidence is not such an easy thing. So just to identify that there is a need is not enough. You need to have facts and evidence that actually justify that there is a need for a new system. I'm not sure that data protection law will reply to the question that you posed, because data protection is not about preventing security. And sometimes we say that data protection and privacy, this is in the context of this balance between security and privacy. Still, we would like to speak more about security while respecting fundamental rights and not so much about balancing. There are limits, of course, and there are moments where the citizens will not be able to take or to accept new steps. This is not so much the data protection question. It's the question of actually to which extent the citizens really understand what is happening and what is happening to their data.